All right, let's get right into it today. We're going deep on some common misconceptions about Islam. We've got this article called "Misconceptions about Islam: What Do You Really Know?" And I'm ready to jump in and see what we find. I think we've all had those moments where we think we know something, and then it turns out it's not quite the full picture.
Yeah, for sure. And honestly, understanding these misconceptions, it's important for a couple of reasons. I mean, obviously, it's about expanding our own knowledge,
Yeah.
but it's also about how we have conversations,
Yeah.
especially in such a diverse world.
Yeah.
Being able to have these conversations in a way that's informed and respectful is so important.
Absolutely. And the article, it starts with one I've heard a lot, this idea that Muslims don't share values with non-Muslims.
Wow.
But then right away, it quotes the Prophet Muhammad saying, the best among you are those who have the best manners and character. And that just doesn't sound that different from, what a lot of us were raised to believe.
No, not at all. It's really interesting because if you look at the core values that Islam emphasizes, honesty, justice, respect for elders, giving back to the community. There's a lot of overlap with other ethical systems and beliefs around the world. It makes you wonder why we jump to those stereotypes so quickly.
Yeah, it really does make you think. And the article, it doesn't just talk about vague ideas either. It gets into specifics like the importance of keeping your promises, for example, and contributing positively to society. Those aren't exactly like niche concepts.
Exactly. It's like we get so caught up in the differences that we kind of forget to see how much our values actually overlap.
Okay, here's one that always makes me scratch my head. This whole idea that Muslims worship like a totally different God and they call him Allah, as if there's this whole other deity out there. Like seriously, I'm curious to hear what you think about this one.
Oh yeah, that's definitely one that gets blown way out of proportion. Allah is just the Arabic word for God. It's the same word that Arabic-speaking Christians and Jews use. The key here is that while Muslims, Jews, and Christians all believe in the same creator, the way they understand and relate to God can be different.
So same God, different interpretations. Got it. Okay, now we're getting into a topic that's, well, pretty sensitive, and I think it's important to address it head on. This idea that Islam somehow permits or even encourages terrorism. And I have to admit, even talking about this is tough because the media often presents such a skewed perspective.
Absolutely. And it's a topic that the article doesn't shy away from either. What's really important to understand is that Islam forbids targeting innocent civilians. In fact, it goes even further than that.
Really? How so?
Well, there's this really strong emphasis on minimizing harm, even to plants and animals. It really highlights just how sacred life is considered in Islamic teachings.
Wow, I had no idea. That reminds me of that really powerful verse from the Quran that the article quotes. It says, if anyone murders an innocent person, it will be as if he has murdered the whole of humanity. And if anyone saves a person, it will be as if he has saved the whole of humanity. It's pretty powerful stuff.
Yeah, it really gets to the heart of it, recognizing that every single life has inherent value. But of course, things aren't always so black and white. The article also touches on the idea of legitimate resistance to occupation, which, that's a whole other conversation with a lot of nuance.
Absolutely. It's not about oversimplifying things, right? There are gray areas, and it's up to each of us to really try to understand those complexities. Okay, let's move on to another big one. The perception that Islam oppresses women. This is something I hear all the time, and it's frustrating because the article is very clear. Equality before God is central to Islam. It even quotes the Quran saying, verily the most honorable of you in the sight of Allah is the most God-conscious.
And that's such an important point, that piety is the real measure of honor. And that applies regardless of gender, wealth, or social status. That really challenges a lot of the assumptions that people have about Islam.
It really does. And the article goes on to list specific rights that Islam guarantees women. Equal pay, the right to choose a spouse, access to education, the right to divorce, and inheritance rights. I mean, that's pretty progressive even by today's standards.
It is. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, sadly, some Muslim women do face oppression in certain parts of the world. But as the article points out, that's often rooted in cultural practices and not the teachings of Islam itself. And that distinction is crucial.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's easy to make generalizations, but we have to remember that experiences can be so different. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here, so let's shift gears a bit and do a rapid fire on a few more misconceptions. Starting with, is the Quran just another book?
No, not at all. Muslims believe it's the word of God, a guide for all humanity. And one thing that's really interesting is the way it uses history and stories to get you thinking and reflecting on the deeper meaning.
I see. And actually, the article encourages people to read the Quran for themselves, which I thought was pretty cool. Don't just take our word for it, go check it out yourself.
Exactly. It's all about seeking knowledge and understanding, right? And that's a challenge I would give to anyone, no matter what your background is.
Okay, here's one I think we should unpack a little bit. This idea that hijab is oppressive to women. I feel like there's a lot of confusion out there about what it actually means.
Yeah, definitely. It's important to understand that for Muslim women who choose to wear it, hijab is seen as a command from God, a way of expressing modesty and focusing on inner beauty. It's not about being invisible or silenced, but about participating in society while maintaining their dignity and personal boundaries.
So it's more about choice and empowerment than oppression.
Exactly. And it really challenges that assumption that all women who wear hijab are somehow forced to do so. It's about reclaiming that agency and defining modesty on their own terms.
Got it. Okay, next up. Are all Muslims Arabs? I mean, come on,
Well,
right?
that's one of those misconceptions that just won't go away. And statistically, it's just not true. Only about 20% of Muslims worldwide are Arab. Islam is a global religion, and its followers come from so many different backgrounds and cultures and ethnicities. The thing that unites them is their belief in one God.
It's a good reminder that you can find common ground even in our differences. Okay, another one that I think sparks a lot of debate. Jihad means terrorism. Let's break that one down.
Yeah, this is where the article dives into the true meaning of jihad, which is so much broader than what we often see in the media. In Islam, jihad refers to a struggle, but it can be a personal struggle for self-improvement, for doing good, for standing up for justice. It's about striving to be a better person.
So not necessarily about violence then.
Right. And even when it comes to military action in Islam, it's only permissible for very specific reasons, like defending yourself or preventing oppression. And there are very clear rules and guidelines, and targeting civilians is absolutely forbidden. It's about justice, not about causing harm for no reason.
Yeah, this really highlights how important it is to understand the context. You can't just take things at face value, right? You have to look deeper. Okay, here's another one that always throws me off. Do Muslims worship Muhammad or like the moon god?
Oh, man. That one just comes from a total lack of understanding of Islam. The Prophet Muhammad himself said very clearly that he should not be worshipped. And the Quran explicitly says that the only being worthy of worship is God. There's just no room for idol worship in Islam.
So pretty straightforward there. Let's talk about forced marriages. Is that something that Islam supports?
No, not at all. Forced marriage is a cultural practice that exists in different parts of the world, but it's not rooted in Islamic teachings. Islam requires that both people freely consent to the marriage. It's about choice, not coercion.
Right, that makes sense. And finally, a big one. Does Islam force people to convert?
Another myth that the article debunks. The Quran actually says, let there be no compulsion in religion. And, Islamic history is full of examples of peaceful coexistence and respect for other faiths. Look at Indonesia, for example. It has the largest Muslim population in the world, but Islam spread there mainly through trade and cultural exchange, not through force.
That's a fascinating example. It goes against that whole narrative of Islam being spread by the sword, right? We've only scratched the surface here. There's just so much to unpack when it comes to these misconceptions about Islam.
Yeah, for sure. And that's what's so cool about these deep dives. We can peel back the layers and come to a more nuanced understanding.
Well, we're not done yet. We've got more to discuss in the next segment, so stick with us, deep divers. Welcome back, everyone. Man, this deep dive has really been eye-opening, hasn't it? I mean, just all these misconceptions about Islam. It's a lot to think about.
It has been fascinating, yeah. And we still have a few more to get to before we wrap up.
Definitely. Okay, one that I think is especially relevant these days is this idea that in Muslim-majority countries, non-Muslims are oppressed. You hear that a lot, but is it true?
Well, the article really challenges that generalization. It talks about this long history of tolerance and peaceful coexistence between Muslims and people of other faiths.
Yeah, I remember it mentioned some specific examples.
Right, like the Islamic Golden Age. It was this period of amazing intellectual and cultural growth, and you had scholars from all different backgrounds, Muslims, Christians, Jews.
Yeah.
They were all working together in these vibrant centers of learning, making these huge contributions to science, math, philosophy. It was a real melting pot.
It's amazing to think about those historical connections, especially when you hear so much about this clash of civilizations.
Exactly. And even today, in many Muslim-majority countries, you have these thriving non-Muslim communities. They're practicing their faiths openly. They're participating in society. They're contributing to their communities. Of course, every society has its problems, but you can't just paint a whole region or religion with one brush.
Right. It's all about nuance.
Right.
Seeing the diversity within any group. Okay, here's one that I find really troubling. This idea that Islam is somehow anti-Semitic. It just doesn't make sense to me. Judaism, Christianity, Islam, they all share those Abrahamic roots.
Yeah, and the article really highlights that. Islam acknowledges and respects the prophets of Judaism. Figures like Abraham, Moses, David, they're all revered in the Islamic tradition. It's this shared heritage that often gets overlooked.
So where does that misconception even come from then? Why do people make that connection?
I think a lot of times it comes down to confusing politics with religious beliefs. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for example, is incredibly complex. And it's easy to just see it as a religious thing. But the reality is there are so many factors involved, political, historical, social. To just boil it down to religion is misleading.
You have to separate those issues. And remember that disagreeing with a government or a policy doesn't mean you hate a whole group of people.
Right. Exactly. And that brings us to one last misconception that the article addresses, this fear that Islam is a threat to Western civilization, a narrative that's become pretty popular, unfortunately.
But the article takes a very different stance, right?
It does. It reminds us of all the ways that Islamic civilization has contributed to the world. Medicine, astronomy, math, art, architecture. These are things that have enriched Western thought and progress for centuries. It's about seeing that connection, that shared history, instead of seeing Islam as something completely foreign or other.
It's about seeing those shared values, too. Human dignity, justice, compassion. Those are at the heart of both Islam and Western traditions.
Absolutely. So, to wrap up this deep dive, I think the takeaway is pretty simple. Approach these complex topics with an open mind and a willingness to learn. Don't let those stereotypes and misinformation cloud your judgment. Seek out different perspectives. Engage in respectful dialogue.
Yeah, understanding doesn't mean agreement. You can learn about a faith or a culture without having to adopt all of its beliefs. It's about empathy, about building those bridges of understanding, especially in a world that's becoming more and more interconnected.
I love that. And to everyone listening out there, take what you've learned today and let it shape how you interact with others. Let it spark your curiosity and encourage you to keep exploring the complexities of a world.
Thanks for joining us on this journey, everyone. Until next time, stay curious.